My name is Riley Hale, and on the night of my father's 55th birthday gala in our home in Greenwich, Connecticut, he slapped me in front of 30 distinguished guests because of a gift he called worthless junk. I am 28 years old, and for the past 6 years, I have worked as a pediatric ICU nurse at Yale New Haven Hospital, earning an annual salary of $82,400, a figure my father, Arthur Vance, considers a rounding error in his logistics empire. That night, the air in our North Street estate was thick with the scent of $400 per plate catering and expensive Jo Malone candles. I stood there, my cheek burning with a fiery heat that contrasted sharply with the cold, calculating look in my father's eyes. My brother Julian, the golden child who spent his days burning through a $15,000 monthly allowance while consulting for the family firm, didn't even flinch. He just adjusted the cuff of his bespoke Tom Ford suit and took a sip of 2012 Dom Perignon, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Now let me take you back to the weeks leading up to that moment. I had spent months scouring antique auctions to find a 1969 vintage Navy-issue Hamilton compass, the exact model my grandfather used when he was a navigator. I paid $1,250 for it, which represented nearly 60 hours of overtime in the ward, tending to infants whose lives hung by a thread. To me, it was a symbol of the Vance legacy before it became about offshore accounts and predatory acquisitions. To Arthur, it was a piece of tarnished brass. When he opened the velvet-lined box and saw the weathered metal instead of a deed to a new vineyard or a Patek Philippe, the vein in his temple began to throb. "Is this a joke, Elena?" he hissed, his voice cutting through the ambient hum of the string quartet. "Julian bought me a limited-edition Audemars Piguet Royal Oak that cost more than your apartment. And you give me trash from a garage sale." The slap came so fast I didn't see it, just the sudden sharp crack of skin on skin and the taste of copper in my mouth. My mother, Eleanor, looked away, smoothing the silk of her $6,000 Oscar de la Renta gown as if she were brushing off a stray piece of lint. "Get out," my father commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You are no longer a Vance. I want your key to this house and the keys to the 2024 black Mercedes GLE on the table. You can walk back to your pathetic life in Stamford." I didn't argue. I reached into my purse, pulled out the key fob and dropped it into a crystal bowl of beluga caviar. I walked out of that mansion, past the valets and the line of luxury SUVs, and began the 2-mile walk toward the train station in the pouring rain. My $200 leather heels were ruined within minutes, the water soaking through my trench coat, but I didn't care. As I sat on the Metro North train, surrounded by the smell of wet wool and floor wax, I looked at my reflection in the dark window. The bruise was already darkening into a deep plum color. I reached into my pocket and felt the small, heavy weight of the compass. I had snatched it back before leaving. My father didn't realize that in my grandfather's journals, he mentioned a secret compartment in this very compass. I pressed the small, invisible latch on the side and the false bottom clicked open. Inside wasn't a note of love, but a microSD card and a small rusted key to a safe deposit box at a Chase Bank branch in Manhattan that had been closed to the family for decades. Arthur thought he had stripped me of my inheritance, but he didn't realize he had just handed me the evidence that could dismantle his entire empire. Family isn't about the blood that flows through your veins or the name on a birth certificate. It's about who stands by you when the world goes dark. My father chose his pride. I chose the truth, and the truth was about to cost him everything he ever cared about. My name is Riley Hale, and I am a 32-year-old former Army captain who spent 3 tours in high-pressure environments only to return home and find that the most dangerous combat zone was sitting right across from my own family in a wood-paneled courtroom in downtown Arlington, Virginia. The air in the room smelled of old paper and the expensive cloying scent of my sister Chloe's $340 Baccarat Rouge 540 perfume, a fragrance that felt like a physical weight against my chest as she leaned forward to deliver her final blow. She is a major in the JAG Corps, a woman who built her entire career on the perceived perfection of our lineage, and right now she was using every ounce of her legal training to paint me as a broken, unstable relic of a war she never had the courage to fight. "She's delusional, dangerous, and can't tell reality from a combat flashback," Chloe sneered with a practiced tremor of concern in her voice that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes as she slammed a thick, fabricated psychiatric report onto the mahogany table. The sound of the paper hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot in the silent room, a sound that would have sent a lesser person ducking for cover, but I remained perfectly still, my spine pressed against the hard back of the defendant's chair. My father, Harrison Hale, sat beside her, his fingers idly adjusting the weight of his $8,500 Breitling Navitimer watch as he offered a solemn, rehearsed nod to Judge Miller. Harrison is the founder of Hale Global Consulting, a firm with a $12 million annual turnover that specialized in the very thing he was currently doing to his own daughter: reputation management and strategic elimination. He looked at me not as a child he had raised, but as a piece of faulty equipment that had outlived its utility and was ready for the scrap heap of history. I sat motionless, staring into the fluorescent void of the courtroom, watching as they conspired to steal my $45 million inheritance, a legacy left to me by my grandfather, a man who actually understood the cost of service. The contrast between us was blinding and spoke volumes about the rot beneath the surface of the Hale name. Chloe lived in a pristine 3,500 square foot mansion in Alexandria, curated to look like a spread in Architectural Digest, while I lived in a 400 square foot studio apartment where the radiator hissed like a wounded animal every time the temperature dropped below freezing. While Harrison spent his weekends at the country club discussing offshore accounts and predatory acquisitions, I spent my days in a dented 2012 tuxedo black Ford F-150 with 180,000 miles on the odometer, driving to veterans outreach centers in the pouring rain. I wore a faded gray hoodie with a frayed hem because every cent of my disability check and my meager savings went toward paying off medical debts for the men in my unit. Debts my family didn't even know existed because they never bothered to ask. They mistook my silence for weakness and my simple life for a lack of ambition, never realizing that my quietness was actually tactical discipline learned in places they couldn't find on a map. They saw a veteran struggling with the transition to civilian life, but they failed to see the operative who was documenting every bribe, every forged signature, and every secret meeting Harrison had conducted to keep his firm afloat during the 2024 fiscal crisis. As the judge reached for the gavel, Harrison caught my eye and offered a thin, triumphant smile, convinced that his wealth and Chloe's lies had finally erased me from the ledger. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and they were about to learn that the worthless daughter they tried to bury was the only one who knew where all the bodies were actually hidden. Family isn't the blood that flows through your veins. Family is the hand that stays steady when the world starts to shake, and mine had let go a long time ago. My name is Riley Hale, and as I sat in a high-backed leather chair on the 42nd floor of the Willis Tower in Chicago, I realized that the people who shared my DNA were more dangerous than any insurgent I had encountered during my 2 tours in the Middle East. The betrayal peaked in a glass-walled law office that overlooked the smog-choked horizon of Lake Michigan, where the air smelled of sterile air conditioning, $9 oat milk lattes from the lobby's artisan cafe, and the suffocatingly expensive cologne my father Harrison favored. My sister, Major Chloe Hale, stood at the head of the mahogany table, her pristine Army service uniform looking like a costume as she slammed a fabricated psychiatric report down with the practiced authority of a commanding officer. She sneered as she read the specific clause regarding my supposed mental instability, her voice echoing off the glass as she demanded full financial guardianship over the $45 million trust my grandfather had left specifically to me. My mother, Evelyn, sat to my left, dabbing her eyes with a $450 Hermes silk scarf in a display of choreographed grief that wouldn't have fooled a recruit in basic training, let alone a seasoned combat veteran. The contrast between us was a physical ache in the room. Chloe lived in a 3,500 square foot mansion in Alexandria and drove a 2024 midnight black Porsche Cayenne, while I spent my nights in a 400 square foot studio in a converted warehouse, driving a dented 2012 tuxedo black Ford F-150 with a transmission that groaned every time I shifted into gear. While Harrison managed a consulting firm with a $12 million annual turnover, I was meticulously scraping together every cent of my $3,737 monthly VA disability check to pay off the private medical debts of the men from my old unit, men the Hale family would never acknowledge. When Chloe leaned in, her manicured hand resting on my shoulder with a weight that felt like lead, she whispered, "This is for your own good, Riley," with a condescending sweetness that made my skin crawl. They had no idea that I had learned to survive in places where they wouldn't last a single minute without their assistance and gold cards. I looked at the mahogany table, noticing the way the sunlight caught the dust motes dancing in the air, a stark difference from the grit and sand of the desert. My father adjusted his $8,500 Breitling watch. A small, impatient movement that signaled he was ready to conclude this transaction and move on to his 2 p.m. lunch at Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse. They mistook my tactical silence for a mental breakdown and my faded gray hoodie for a white flag of surrender. They didn't realize that while they were busy forging psychiatric evaluations and leaking stories to their social circles in Greenwich, I had been using my GI Bill to finish a degree in forensic accounting. Every flashback they claimed I was having was actually a moment of intense focus where I was cross-referencing the Hales offshore tax shelters with the erratic spending of Harrison's failing firm. As the judge's clerk began to organize the paperwork for the guardianship order, I felt nothing but a cold, hard resolve settling in my chest. Family isn't about the blood that flows through your veins or the prestigious names etched into brass plaques. Family is who stays steady when the truth finally comes out. And as I reached into my bag to pull out the files that would dismantle their $12 million empire, I knew the Hales were about to find out exactly how much a combat veteran remembers when her back is against the wall. This wasn't a mental collapse. It was a counteroffensive, and for the first time in years I was the one holding the high ground. That night, I sat in the oppressive silence of my 400-square-foot studio apartment in a converted industrial laundry building in West Loop. The space illuminated only by the sterile, flickering blue glow of my dual 32-inch Asus ProArt monitors. The air smelled of stale, over-roasted coffee from a $2.50 cup I'd picked up at a 24-hour Greasy Spoon diner on Halsted Street, and the only sound was the rhythmic metallic clacking of my mechanical keyboard. On a grease-stained paper napkin from that same diner, I had meticulously mapped out the structural collapse of the Hale family legacy using a drying ballpoint pen. Chloe was currently $1.2 million underwater from a series of disastrous high-leverage real estate flips in Scottsdale, Arizona, a fact she had hidden behind filtered Instagram photos of infinity pools and $15 cocktails. My father, Harrison, was even more vulnerable. His prestigious consulting firm was exactly 48 hours away from a mandatory federal audit that would reveal $4.2 million in misallocated infrastructure funds. To the world, they were the pinnacle of Chicago high society, the kind of people who spent $12,000 on seasonal gala tables, but to me they were just poorly managed assets waiting to be liquidated. I leaned back in my $150 refurbished office chair, the springs groaning under my weight as I pulled a custom-encrypted iron key drive from the pocket of my faded gray hoodie. My family had spent years treating my military service like a tragic stain on their reputation, never realizing that the tactical signals intelligence training I received at Fort Huachuca made their civilian cybersecurity look like a child's toy. I began entering 256-bit alphanumeric codes that simply do not exist in any public or civilian registry, bypass protocols designed to safeguard data they thought had been buried under layers of expensive legal non-disclosure agreements and shredded physical files. As the progress bar on my screen crawled toward 100%, I watched the reflected light dance across the dented surface of my 2012 Ford F-150 parked, just visible through the cracked window downstairs under a flickering street lamp. Love was an illusion that my mother, Evelyn, sold in the form of $450 Hermes scarves and choreographed tears, but numbers were a tangible weapon I had spent a decade learning to aim with lethal precision. I accessed the internal ledger of Hale Global Consulting, watching the red lines of debt bleed across the spreadsheet like an open wound. Chloe's major status in the JAG Corps wouldn't protect her from the paper trail of wire fraud I was currently uncovering, a trail that led directly from her Scottsdale shell companies to Harrison's primary operating account at Chase. They had spent my entire life making me feel small, casting me as the broken daughter while they built a fortress out of lies and stolen capital. But as I hit the final command key to mirror their encrypted servers, I realized that the greatest mistake a predator can make is assuming their prey has forgotten how to hunt. They wanted to declare me mentally unfit to steal a $45 million inheritance, but they were about to find out that a combat veteran with nothing to lose is the most dangerous accountant in the world. Family isn't the blood that flows through your veins or the prestigious name on a glass office door. Family is the bridge that holds when the storm hits, and the Hales had burned every bridge they ever built. As the first light of dawn began to gray the Chicago skyline, I closed my laptop with a definitive click, knowing that by Monday morning, the only thing left of the Hale empire would be the headlines. The precision of a military operation is rarely about the noise of the explosion but rather the quiet calibration of the sights before the trigger is even touched. At exactly 7:15 the next morning, I stood outside the heavy reinforced oak door of the Director of Medical Operations for JSOC, Dr. Silas Vance, in a secure wing of a facility that doesn't officially appear on any municipal map of the greater Chicago area. The corridor was silent, save for the hum of a high-efficiency HVAC system and the distant rhythmic clicking of a security officer's boots on the polished linoleum. I was no longer wearing the faded gray hoodie that my family viewed as a shroud of my failure. Instead, I wore a crisp charcoal gray tactical blazer and tailored trousers, my back straight with the muscle memory of a decade in uniform. The room smelled of ozone from a high-capacity air purifier, expensive leather, and the distinct dry scent of old paper and archived intelligence reports. On the far wall, illuminated by recessed LED lighting, hung a massive topographical map of the Levant with red and blue acetate markings that only a handful of individuals in the global intelligence community would actually understand. Dr. Vance sat behind a minimalist desk carved from a single slab of slate, his 2026 Breitling emergency 2 watch glinting under the desk lamp as he gestured for me to sit. I didn't just bring my standard military medical records to prove my sanity. I placed a ruggedized, encrypted Dell Latitude 7330 Rugged Extreme laptop on the slate surface and opened a file that contained a complete forensic log of Major Chloe Hale's financial treason. The screen displayed a cascading waterfall of digital evidence. Exactly 25 wire transfers, each for the specific amount of $40,000, routed through a complex labyrinth of shell companies based in the Cayman Islands and eventually terminating in a private account used to fund her disastrous real estate flips in Scottsdale. My sister and father are attempting to use the legal system to declare me mentally unfit for service and life, all to trigger a guardianship clause that would allow them to liquidate my $45 million trust to cover the $4.2 million deficit in Harrison's firm, I stated, my voice echoing with a flat clinical detachment that surprised even me. Vance adjusted his spectacles, his eyes scanning the metadata of the transfers, proof that Chloe had used her JAG core credentials to bypass standard banking flags. The contrast between this room and the 42nd floor law office was absolute. Here the only currency that mattered was the truth of the mission. While my mother, Evelyn, was likely at that very moment sipping a $12 macchiato in her Gold Coast penthouse and dabbing fake tears with her $450 Hermes scarf, I was presenting the kill chain of their financial empire. They think my silence over the last 6 months was a symptom of a combat-related breakdown, but it was actually the quietest reconnaissance of my career, I added, watching as Vance pulled a secure physical file from a locked drawer. He looked at the evidence of the 25 transfers, a total of $1 million in stolen capital, and then looked directly into my eyes, seeing the captain I used to be rather than the broken daughter my family had invented. The weight of the silence in the office was broken only by the soft whir of the laptop's cooling fan. My father, Harrison, thought he was the master of strategy with his $12 million consulting firm, but he had forgotten that he raised a daughter who was trained to survive in environments where the temperature hit 120 degrees and the margin for error was zero. They want to declare me unfit to cover their own fraud with my grandfather's money, and they expect me to go quietly into a psychiatric facility while they spend my legacy, I concluded, my hands steady as I handed him a physical flash drive containing the mirrored server data from Hale Global Consulting. Dr. Vance didn't offer a platitude or a scripted apology. He simply closed the laptop, leaned back in his chair and gave a sharp, decisive nod. Captain Riley Hale, the Hales have mistaken a tactical pause for a permanent retreat, he said, his voice cold and professional. Initiate counter-operation. We will provide the medical clearance and the federal oversight for the audit of Harrison's firm immediately. As I walked out of the office and into the crisp morning air of the city, I realized that family isn't the blood that flows through your veins, but the people who trust your word when the rest of the world is screaming lies. The battle for the $45 million was over. The war for the Hale name had just begun. The trap was set for the final hearing in courtroom 402 of the Dirksen Federal Building, a space that felt less like a hall of justice and more like a high-stakes operating theater where the Hales intended to surgically remove my future. It was exactly 10:14 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and a freezing gray Chicago rain was lashing against the reinforced glass windows, blurred by the streaks of city grime that made the skyline look like a charcoal sketch. The room smelled of industrial floor wax, old wood, and the suffocatingly heavy scent of Chloe's $340 Baccarat Rouge 540 perfume, which seemed to fill every corner of the gallery. My sister, Major Chloe Hale, arrived in her full Army service uniform dress blues, her brass buttons polished to a blinding shine and her medals arranged with a precision that bordered on clinical. She wasn't alone. She had brought a literal phalanx of destruction consisting of 5 hand-picked character witnesses from her social circle in Alexandria and a specialist psychiatrist, Dr. Eris Thorne, who famously charged $500 an hour to confirm whatever narrative his wealthy benefactors required. Chloe looked every bit the victor, her jaw set in a mask of concerned siblinghood as she clutched the thick manila folder that contained the forged psychiatric evaluations meant to be my lifelong cage. I walked into the room last, the heavy oak doors thudding shut behind me with a finality that echoed through the high-vaulted ceiling. I wasn't wearing the faded gray hoodie they expected to see as proof of my instability. Instead, I wore a sharp, custom-tailored dark navy suit from Theory that felt like Kevlar armor against my skin. I carried nothing but a single titanium-cased Kingston Iron Key USB drive gripped tightly in my right hand, a small device that contained the digital ghost of every illicit transaction Harrison had ever authorized. There were exactly 18 people in the room, including the court reporter, the 3-person legal team Harrison had retained for $1,200 an hour, and a bailiff whose hand never moved more than an inch away from his holster as he scanned the room with bored, predatory eyes. My father, Harrison, sat at the petitioner's table, his $8,500 Breitling Navitimer glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights as he checked the time, clearly anxious to finish this family matter before his 12:30 p.m. reservation at the University Club. The contrast between their perceived reality and the tactical truth was a physical vibration in the air. Evelyn, my mother, was seated in the front row, her $450 Hermes scarf draped perfectly over her shoulders as she offered a watery, rehearsed smile to the judge, playing the role of the heartbroken matriarch to perfection. They had spent months building a fortress of lies, convinced that my 400-square-foot studio and my dented 2012 Ford F-150 were evidence of a mind lost to the shadows of the desert. They didn't realize that while they were busy curating their reputations in 3,500-square-foot mansions, I had been conducting a long-range reconnaissance of their financial ruin. Chloe leaned toward her attorney, whispering something that made them both glance at me with pity, but I simply adjusted my cufflinks and sat down at the defense table. I looked at the digital clock on the wall as it ticked to 10:15 a.m., the exact moment the federal audit of Hale Global Consulting was scheduled to begin 3 blocks away. As the judge entered the room and everyone rose, I felt a calm, cold resolve settle over me that was sharper than any blade. They had mistaken my silence for a surrender and my discipline for a disability, never understanding that a combat veteran doesn't start a fight unless she already knows exactly how it's going to end. Family isn't the name engraved on a trust fund or the blood that shares a history of betrayal. Family is the bridge that holds when the weight of the truth finally descends. As I looked at Harrison and Chloe, I realized they weren't my family anymore. They were just targets on a map I had already cleared. The hearing was about to begin, and for the first time in 32 years, I was the one holding all the high-caliber ammunition. The air in courtroom 402 was thick with the scent of floor wax and the metallic tang of a failing HVAC system as Dr. Eris Thorne took the stand, his $1,200 charcoal gray suit bunching at the shoulders as he adjusted the microphone with a practiced, condescending grace. For 15 grueling minutes, he dismantled my existence, using a clinical, monotone voice to describe my hypervigilance and emotional detachment, not as the survival traits of a decorated army captain, but as the jagged shards of a collapsing mind. He cited my preference for the 400-square-foot studio apartment over the family estate as a withdrawal from reality, and my choice to drive a 2012 tuxedo black Ford F-150 with a rusted tailgate as a rejection of functional societal norms. My father, Harrison, leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, a smug, infinitesimal smile playing on his lips while his thumb idly traced the edge of his $8,500 Breitling Navitimer, looking for all the world like a man who had already cashed the check. Beside him, my mother, Evelyn, performed her curated grief, dabbing her eyes with the corner of her $450 Hermes silk scarf, squeezing out choreographed tears that caught the harsh glare of the overhead fluorescent lights. Judge Miller looked down at me from the bench with a heavy, suffocating pity, The exact kind of look a vet gives a stray dog in a roadside shelter right before the needle is prepped. It was a gaze that assumed my defeat was a mercy, a necessary conclusion to a life they deemed broken by the very service that gave me my strength. Chloe, sitting in her pristine Army service uniform dress blues, leaned over to whisper something into her lead attorney's ear, her eyes darting toward the $45 million trust documents on the mahogany table as if she were already calculating the down payment on a second Scottsdale property or perhaps a 2026 Porsche 911 Turbo S to replace her current Cayenne. She looked like a victor standing over a fallen enemy, completely unaware that her specialist psychiatrist's testimony was merely providing the time-stamped evidence of her own perjury. The silence that followed Dr. Thorne's closing statement was deafening, broken only by the scratching of the court reporter's stenograph and the rhythmic lashing of freezing rain against the reinforced windows of the Chicago skyscraper. They truly believed the game was over before I even stood up, convinced that their wealth, their fabricated reports, and their $500 an hour experts had successfully built a cage I could never escape. My hand tightened around the cool, heavy titanium casing of the USB drive in my pocket. The metal grounded against my palm as I watched Harrison check his watch again, clearly impatient to get to his 12:30 p.m. lunch at the university club. He thought he was presiding over a funeral for my autonomy, but he didn't realize he was actually attending the opening arguments for his own federal indictment. I felt a cold, tactical resolve settle into my marrow, a feeling familiar to anyone who has ever waited in the dark for a target to enter the kill zone. Family isn't the blood that flows through your veins or the prestigious name on a birth certificate. Family is the hand that stays steady when the truth finally comes out. And as I rose to take the stand, I knew the Hales were about to find out that the daughter they tried to bury was the only one who truly understood the price of the ground they were standing on. The silence in courtroom 402 was so absolute that I could hear the faint rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the distant muffled siren of a Chicago PD cruiser navigating the flooded streets of the Loop 42 floors below us. My sister, Major Chloe Hale, sat back in her chair with a look of smug, predatory triumph, her hands folded neatly over the brass buttons of her Army service uniform dress blues as if she had already placed the crown on her own head. My father, Harrison, checked his $8,500 Breitling Navitimer with an impatient flick of his wrist, his $1,200 an hour legal team already beginning to pack their leather briefcases in anticipation of a swift victory. They thought they had buried me under a mountain of fabricated psychiatric reports and the testimony of a $500 an hour specialist who had never even seen me in a clinical setting. Your Honor, my sister is right about one thing. I have been watching her very closely, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy, sterile air of the room like a surgical scalpel through silk. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to because the sudden, sharp clarity of my tone caused the judge to pause with his gavel midair. I stood up slowly, the fabric of my dark navy theory suit whispering against the leather chair, and walked toward the digital projector station with a measured, tactical gait that felt like a shadow of the person they claimed was broken. I bypassed their expensive legal team without a glance, my fingers moving with practiced, rhythmic precision as I entered a 16-digit encrypted bypass code into the court's interface, a code my father's IT department thought was uncrackable. Instead of the blurred medical files and forged Rorschach tests they expected to see, the massive overhead screen flickered to life, displaying a high-definition real-time ledger of the Hale family trust that glowed with a cold, blue light. The air in the room seemed to vanish as the screen mapped out a complex, spider-webbed architecture of unauthorized siphoning, showing exactly 25 transfers of $40,000 each moving from my grandfather's legacy into a Panamanian shell company directly linked to Harrison and Company. Chloe's face, previously a mask of military discipline, drained of color until she matched the ivory tone of her $450 Hermes scarf, her breath catching in a jagged, audible hitch. Harrison's smug smile didn't just fade. It disintegrated, replaced by a raw, naked panic as he realized the delusional daughter he tried to institutionalize had just performed a full-scale digital extraction of his darkest secrets. The judge leaned forward, his spectacles slipping down the bridge of his nose as he stared at the cascading red lines of debt and the black market routing numbers that proved my father's $12 million consulting firm was a house of cards held together by my stolen inheritance. I didn't look at them with anger. I looked at them with the same clinical detachment I used when monitoring a flatlining patient in the ICU, recognizing that the people who shared my DNA were nothing more than a failed experiment in greed. Every cent of my $3,737 monthly disability check that I had spent living in a 400-square-foot studio and driving a dented 2012 Ford F-150 had been a small price to pay for the silence I needed to build this trap. They mistook my tactical discipline for a mental breakdown and my distance for a detachment from reality, never understanding that while they were playing at high society, I was conducting a long-range reconnaissance of their inevitable ruin. Family isn't the blood that flows through your veins or the prestigious name on an $8 million estate. Family is the bridge that remains standing when the floods of truth finally arrive. And as the bailiff stepped toward the petitioner's table, I realized the Hales were about to find out that the only thing more dangerous than a combat veteran is one who knows exactly how to read the ledger. The hearing wasn't about my sanity anymore. It was the opening credits for their federal indictment. The silence in courtroom 402 was no longer the respectful hush of a legal proceeding but the suffocating, absolute vacuum that precedes a total structural collapse. I stood by the projector, the cool casing of my titanium USB drive still warm from the port, as I activated the final file. A 45-second high-fidelity audio clip captured via a subminiature GSM bug-eyed planted in the mahogany base of Harrison's $4,500 executive desk 3 weeks prior. The room, which smelled of wet wool and the $9 artisan lattes Chloe's legal team had brought in, suddenly echoed with the booming, unfiltered resonance of my father's voice, stripped of its public-facing charisma. Once Riley is in the institution, we move the remaining $30 million before the auditors flag the Scottsdale deficit. The recording blared, the digital clarity capturing even the distinct clink of a crystal tumbler against a glass coaster. My sister, Major Chloe Hale, underwent a physical transformation that was almost visceral. The smug, predatory triumph that had defined her face for the last 2 hours evaporated, replaced by a sickly ashen shade of gray that made her Army service uniform dress blues look like a shroud. Her grip on the manila folder, the one containing the $500 an hour fabricated psychiatric reports meant to be my prison sentence, tightened so violently that her knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white, the paper crinkling with a sharp, frantic sound that cut through the playback. My mother, Evelyn, stopped her choreographed sobbing instantly, her $450 Hermes silk scarf falling forgotten to her lap as her mouth hung open in a silent, ugly gasp that shattered the perfect family facade she had spent 30 years curating. The contrast in the room was blinding. Harrison sat frozen, his hand still resting near his $8,500 Breitling watch, but his eyes were fixed on the judge with the hollow, wide-eyed stare of a man who realized he had just walked into his own execution. I didn't look away from them, my spine remaining as straight as it had been during my 7:15 meeting with Dr. Vance at GE, the charcoal gray tactical blazer I wore feeling like a second skin. Every detail of their betrayal was now illuminated under the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of the Dirksen Federal Building, from the unauthorized siphoning of my grandfather's $45 million trust to the desperate attempts to cover Chloe's $1.2 million real estate failures in Arizona. The judge leaned forward, his spectacles reflecting the blue glow of the digital ledger still projected on the screen, his expression shifting from pity for a broken veteran to the cold, hard steel of a man seeing a federal felony in progress. While they had spent months planning my institutionalization in a 3,500-square-foot Alexandria mansion, I had been living in a 400-square-foot studio, using my tactical signals intelligence training to turn their own technology into the evidence that would dismantle their lives. They had mistaken my silence and my dented 2012 Ford F-150 for a lack of competence, never realizing that a combat veteran doesn't need a $12 million consulting firm to win a war of attrition. Family isn't the name engraved on a brass plaque or the blood that flows through your veins. Family is the bridge that stays standing when the truth finally descends with the weight of a mountain. As the bailiff stepped toward the petitioner's table and the $1,200 an hour lawyers began to whisper in panicked, frantic tones, I realized the perfect Hales were about to find out that the only thing more dangerous than the secrets they kept was the daughter who knew exactly where to find them. The audio clip ended with a sharp digital click, and in the ensuing silence, the only sound left was the rain lashing against the glass, washing away the last remains of a legacy built on lies. The digital evidence of the siphoned funds was still glowing on the courtroom's 85-inch LG Ultra HD monitor, casting a ghostly blue pallor over my father's face that made his $1,200 charcoal Hugo Boss suit look like a funeral shroud. I stood at the center of courtroom 402, the soles of my theory pumps rooted to the industrial carpet, and turned my gaze toward Judge Miller, whose spectacles were perched precariously on the bridge of his nose as he scanned the cascading red lines of the Hale Global Consulting deficit. Your Honor, my sister and father have spent the last 2 hours attempting to weaponize my service against me, using a paid specialist to transform my tactical discipline into a clinical pathology, I said, my voice maintaining the low, steady resonance of a pre-mission briefing. I bypassed my own legal counsel and walked directly toward the bench, presenting a single heavy sheet of cream-colored stationery embossed with the official gold seal of the Department of Defense. This wasn't a psychiatric evaluation from a $500 an hour consultant who had never seen the underside of a Humvee. It was a certified letter from the Director of Medical Operations for JSOC, Dr. Silas Vance, dated only 48 hours ago. The room was so quiet that the only sound was the frantic rhythmic scratching of the court reporter's stenograph and the distant muffled groan of a bus braking on the rain-slicked asphalt of Dearborn Street far below. The document I handed to the judge wasn't a diagnosis of a collapsing mind. It was a formal security clearance renewal and a high-level commendation for exceptional psychological resilience under extreme duress, specifically citing my ability to maintain operational integrity during the 2023 extraction in the Helmand province. I watched the judge's eyes move across the page, his expression shifting with glacial slowness from the patronizing pity he had shown me all morning to a cold, hard steel that mirrored the overcast Chicago sky. I turned my head to look my sister directly in the eye, watching as the shadow of her Army service uniform dress blues seemed to shrink under the weight of my stare. You studied the manuals in a climate-controlled office in Alexandria, Chloe, but I lived the war in places where the sand gets into your soul and stays there, I said, my words deliberate and sharp as a combat knife. You aren't sitting here today because you're trying to save your sister from herself. You're sitting here because you're trying to survive the fallout of your own greed and the $1.2 million debt from your failed Scottsdale real estate flips. Chloe's hand, which had been resting confidently on the mahogany table, began to tremble with a fine, uncontrollable vibration that caused her $450 Hermes silk scarf to slide off her shoulder and flutter to the floor like a wounded bird. My father, Harrison, didn't even look at me. He was staring at the 16-digit bypass code I had used to unlock his private server, his face a mask of raw, naked panic as he realized the delusional daughter he tried to bury had been conducting a long-range reconnaissance of his entire criminal enterprise for months. The contrast was absolute. They were surrounded by the symbols of a $12 million a year empire, from Harrison's $8,500 Breitling watch to the 5 character witnesses they had paid to lie for them, while I stood there with nothing but a single piece of paper and the truth. They had mistaken my 400-square-foot studio and my dented 2012 Ford F-150 for signs of defeat, never understanding that a soldier doesn't need a mansion to hold the high ground. Family isn't the name on a trust fund or the blood that flows through your veins. Family is the bridge that stays standing when the flood of reality finally arrives. As the judge looked toward the defense table with a gaze that promised a federal indictment, I realized that the Hales were finally going to learn what happens when you try to declare war on someone who has already survived one. The aftermath of the hearing in courtroom 402 was not a slow burn but a swift and surgical strike that dismantled the Hale dynasty in less time than it took for the freezing Chicago rain to turn into a bitter sleet. 3 hours after I stepped down from the witness stand, the heavy brass-handled doors of the Dirksen Federal Building swung open to reveal a sight that felt like the final, satisfying click of a well-oiled machine. My sister, Major Chloe Hale, was escorted out of the courthouse in handcuffs by a detachment of military police, her pristine Army service uniform dress blues now a mockery of the oath she had betrayed. The silver handcuffs bit into her wrists, contrasting sharply with the $45,000 Audemars Piguet Royal Oak she had bragged about, as she was charged with wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and the embezzlement of military-adjacent funds totaling over $1.2 million. She looked at me one last time, her face a sickly, ashen mask of desperation, but I simply adjusted the lapel of my Navy theory suit and watched as they loaded her into the back of a black 2025 Chevrolet Tahoe with government plates. While Chloe was being processed, my father, Harrison, was handed a formal summons from the IRS for $4.5 million in back taxes, interest and penalties related to the misallocated infrastructure funds of Hale Global Consulting. He stood on the sidewalk, his $8,500 Breitling watch suddenly feeling like a lead weight as he realized that the federal audit I triggered had stripped away the $12 million facade he had spent decades building. His high-priced legal team, who had been charging $1,200 an hour to destroy my life, vanished into the gray afternoon mist the moment they realized the retainer checks would soon start bouncing. My mother, Evelyn, was left standing alone in the center of our 10,000-square-foot estate in Alexandria, a house that smelled of Joe Malone candles and old money, but which was now scheduled for foreclosure by the end of the month. She clutched her $450 Hermes silk scarf as if it were a life raft, staring at the empty rooms where the curated silence of her perfect family had been replaced by the cold reality of a $4.2 million deficit. They had spent months trying to lock me in a psychiatric cage to hide their own crimes, but in their arrogance, they ended up building a prison of their own design, stone by fraudulent stone. As I walked to my dented 2012 tuxedo black Ford F-150, the engine turning over with a familiar honest growl, I felt a sense of peace that no amount of grandfather's $45 million inheritance could ever buy. I drove past the university club where Harrison had intended to celebrate my institutionalization, the wipers clearing the sleet from my windshield with a steady rhythmic thud. I was returning to my 400-square-foot studio, a space that was small and honest and entirely mine, leaving behind the wreckage of a legacy built on the blood of others. Family isn't the name etched in gold on a glass office door or the prestigious bloodline that shares your DNA. Family is the bridge that stays standing when the truth finally descends with the weight of a mountain. They tried to bury me, but they forgot that I was trained to fight in the dark, and as I merged into the traffic on I-90, I realized that for the first time in 32 years, the only person I had to answer to was myself. The Hale name was dead, but Riley Hale was finally free. My name is Riley Hale, and as I sit here on the expansive wraparound porch of my newly acquired timber frame retreat in the rugged heart of the Montana wilderness near Bozeman, I am finally breathing air that doesn't taste like the stagnant, expensive lies of a Chicago boardroom. The property spans exactly 500 acres of ancient, towering ponderosa pines and Douglas firs, a landscape so vast and indifferent to human greed that it makes the Hales' $12 million consulting empire look like a frantic ant hill. The only sound accompanying the rhythmic creak of my cedar rocking chair is the low, mournful sigh of the mountain wind through the needles and the piercing, distant call of a golden eagle circling over the Gallatin River. Below me, parked in the gravel driveway, my 2012 tuxedo black Ford F-150 looks like a battle-scarred relic against the pristine wilderness, but its presence is a reminder of the tactical discipline that allowed me to survive long enough to reach this sanctuary. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why this silence is so precious, you have to understand the final surgical cut I had to make to separate the parasites from my pulse. After the federal agents led Chloe away in her dress blues and the IRS began the systematic liquidation of Harrison's assets, the frantic calls began, voicemails filled with my mother's rehearsed sobs and my father's desperate, wheezing demands for a loan to cover his legal retainers. They didn't see a daughter. They saw a $45 million life raft for their sinking ship of vanity and fraud. I spent my final night in that 400-square-foot Stamford studio, lit only by the glowing blue screens of my workstation, watching the final digital ripples of their destruction. I didn't engage with their histrionics or respond to the 47 missed calls from Evelyn's unlisted number. Instead, I opened a final encrypted email draft addressed to the entire Hale inner circle. In the subject line, I typed nothing, and in the body of the message I entered only a single stark figure: $0. That number represented the exact amount of emotional labor, financial support, and cellular recognition they would receive from me for the rest of their natural lives. I hit send at exactly 3 a.m., the same hour we used to begin movements in the desert, and then I physically crushed the SIM card of my phone with the heel of my tactical boot. I left the keys to the studio on the counter alongside a $50 tip for the building's superintendent and drove west, leaving the 10,000-square-foot foreclosure in Alexandria and the 42nd floor law offices in my rearview mirror until the skyscrapers were replaced by the jagged, honest teeth of the Rockies. Now, as the sun begins to dip behind the snow-capped peaks of the Bridger Range, casting long violet shadows across my porch, I reach for a heavy mug of black coffee, the steam rising in a thin, steady plume into the crisp 45-degree air. The $45 million inheritance is no longer a burden or a target for scavengers. It is a foundation for a life defined by utility rather than vanity. My father thought he could declare me mentally unfit to steal my grandfather's legacy, never realizing that the resilience he tried to pathologize was the very thing that would eventually be his undoing. Family isn't the shared DNA that allows a person to bleed you dry, nor is it the prestigious name etched into a brass plaque at a country club. Family is the bridge that holds steady when the truth finally descends with the weight of a mountain. I have burned the bridges that led back to the Hales, and in the resulting fire, I finally found the light to see my way home. I am Riley Hale, a combat veteran, a survivor of the most intimate kind of warfare, and for the first time in 32 years, the silence is not a void to be filled but a victory to be savored. This is not just a new chapter. It is a completely different book, written in a language they will never understand, where the only currency that matters is the peace of a clear conscience and the vast, unbuyable horizon of the American West.